Americans have had a love-hate relationship with their automobiles for more than a century. Regardless of the make, model, or vintage, we seem to praise and curse them with equal vigor. This attitude probably began September 20th, 1893. That's the day Frank Duryea started the American automobile industry by rolling out his first car, scaring horses and humans alike. The improvements and design changes since those early days have been more evolutionary than revolutionary. Car owners today frequently claim they only want basic transportation, but at the same time they relish automotive creature comforts. Power steering has made one-finger parking easy, but we forget how much strength was needed before this standard equipment was even an option. It is rare to find a late model car without air conditioning. Compact disc players, power door locks, and other amenities are in great demand. Our attitudes and actions regarding highways and traffic are just as conflicting. Good weather and light traffic make a country drive pleasant, and we reach our destination in comfort. Compare that attitude with the 5 o'clock freeway follies when we curse those other drivers, the ones who cause traffic jams. Do we ever reflect on how cars and trucks came into being, or do we take highway travel for granted? Life on the country's western frontier has long been glamorized in books and movies. The recent sesquicentennial ceremonies on the Oregon Trail make us appreciate the sacrifices of those early migrants. But how did long-distance automobile travel become a fact of life? What was it like when cars and covered wagons were on the Oregon Trail at the same time? How was North America's first east-to-west car trip conducted, and what made it the country's first transcontinental car race? We'll explore those questions and more when we drop racing's green flag on From Hellgate to Portland. Early 20th century America found the machine age in full swing. The steam power that moved trains now helped the nation's farmers. Steam tractors with huge leather belts operated threshing machines and other farm equipment. There were only about 60,000 cars in the entire country. Paved roads outside city limits simply did not exist. Some reports say the total mileage of America's hard-surfaced roads would have barely stretched from New York to Boston, a distance of little more than 200 miles. Bicycles were an accepted form of mechanical transportation, but the two-wheelers were already voicing grave disgust over the lack of decent roads. They formed what evolved into the National Good Roads Association, the country's first highway lobby. As might be expected, the goal was singular: to start the country building adequate roads. Industry, businesses, and railroads immediately endorsed the concept. Annual conventions were held to generate public support and bring pressure at every level of government. The 1905 convention was to be hosted by a mini World's Fair, the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition in Portland, Oregon. The expo featured an international variety of buildings, including the world's largest log cabin. This gigantic wooden structure would have a supporting role for the Good Roads people in their first national demonstration project. The idea was to have a delegate drive a car up to the cabin's front door. That was no big deal, but the drive was to begin in New York. There were hardly any roads, fewer bridges, no garages, just blacksmith shops. Among the dozens of automobile manufacturers in the United States, only Olds Motor Works accepted this cross-country challenge. Olds management acknowledged the never-ending American obsession to be first and fastest. This advertisement was placed in major publications nationwide. Entries came in by the hundreds from young men seeking adventure. 2 curved dash runabouts were provided, and a cash prize of $1,000 was pledged for the winning 2-man team. That made it America's first transcontinental car race. Olds Motor Works banked on the curved dash runabout's reliability. In 1903, a 4-horsepower model had been driven from San Francisco to Portland, Maine, but an east-to-west drive had never been accomplished. An enthusiastic crowd of men and boys turned out for the race start Saturday, May 8, 1905. Women and girls, however, were conspicuously absent. Pre-race preparation included naming the cars as Old Steady and Old Scout. Fenders were removed to cut down weight. Carbide lamps were installed for night driving. Some reports say the weight of spare parts and tools meant that teams could not even pack a change of clothes. Percy McGargle, an automotive and bicycle journalist from Buffalo, New York, was selected to drive Old steady. His co-driver was Old's factory worker Bart Stanchfield. Dwight Huss was at the tiller of Old Scout. His co-driver came from another Olds plant, Milford Weigel. Huss was a longtime Olds employee, having raced the Curve Dash as early as 1902 in Rhode Island. Racing obviously was a factory byword, with Huss and Ransom Olds himself challenging each other on Detroit's Belle Isle, the site now of one of the IndyCar races every year. Ransom was in the lead, but looking over his shoulder at a charging Huss. Huss was one of America's first internationally competitive drivers. In 1903, he took honors in the Royal Auto Club's reliability run and placed in other competitive events on the European continent. His contact with Olds dealers took him to Moscow, where he set a new Russian precedent. Dwight's son, John, explains.
The Zemblecki brothers were dealers in Moscow, and he got the brothers, and they drove up to the Kremlin. And of course, there hadn't been any automobiles that were allowed to go into that area. And the Zemblecki brothers talked to the guards, and then my dad passed over, I think about 10 rubles, which is about $5 in American money. And the guards let them drive in. And then Dad, he got on top of the shoulders of one of the Zemblecki brothers, and he subscribed his name on one of the bells that was there. The czars were ruling at that time. Communism hadn't come in yet.
A crowd of reporters waved their derbies to start the race. These journalists had no microphones or video cameras in those pre-broadcast days. A carriage driver kept his whip handy in case his horse bolted when the engines were cranked up. Worldwide curiosity dictated newspaper copy would be filed at almost every stop. The good roads people told the drivers to keep daily logs on road conditions. Huss had no love of writing and was terrified of using a pen or pencil. This was clearly illustrated in the first telegram he sent back to Olds Motor Works.
Albany, New York, May 8th, 1905. Arrived okay, 8 o'clock. Car running fine. Syracuse tomorrow. D. Huss.
McGargle's logs and telegrams were far more descriptive as a result of his journalism background. His first day's journal might have been a prediction of challenges yet to come.
It had rained in the night, harder than we'd supposed, and the roads were full of mud and water. Owing to the mud guards having been stripped from both Old Steady and Old Scout, we were soon covered from head to foot with mire, while our luggage and supplies, strapped on the rear deck, were almost unrecognizable when Syracuse was finally reached.
Let's put this historic event in some sort of transportation perspective. Unlike current Indianapolis 500 cars, there was no digital telemetry or radio communications in early racing. Perspective was gained during pit stops. That's just what we'll call our sidebar perspective, a pit stop. Excitement was the order of the day as the race started, but few people gave any thought to the impact the motor vehicle would have at home or abroad. The very idea of mechanized travel over publicly owned roads would require changing a mindset that had been in existence for centuries. Most, if not all, of America's early roads and bridges were privately built and intended to generate a profit. The February 1804 date on this toll sheet from the Chelsea Bridge near Boston could, just as easily, have been dated 100 years later when the race began. Would Americans expand their vision and travel, or would a parochial attitude prevail? Would farmers and city dwellers look at the vehicle differently? Few would have predicted the influence this industry would have on jobs and economy, although Olds Motor Works was already exporting cars to 13 countries by 1903. Postcards of the Curve Dash climbing steps in Russia had captions in French and German. But what did it all mean? It was easy for Americans in 1905 to overlook the concept of public road building an idea that began before the advent of the automobile.
By our standards, it might not have looked like much, but there was some fairly extensive lobbying efforts by the bicycle movement. Colonel Albert Pope of the Pope Manufacturing Company was involved in a number of different activities, but among them he was one of the leading bicycle manufacturers. He organized the League of American Wheelmen primarily to serve as a lobbying organization. And the lobbying activities continued right through, and indeed even took place under the direction of the first couple of leaders of the Bureau of Public Roads.
Let's rejoin Old Scout and Old Steady in serious competition.
At Yonkers, we were warned by policemen to cut down our speed. Threatening clouds came up with a short drizzle during the afternoon. This was the first rain we encountered. Thereafter, we saw rain almost every day throughout the trip, except in parts of Wyoming country.
Albany, New York, May 8, 1905. Arrived 8:30. Bad puncture and broken searchlight bracket. Car perfect. P.F. McGargle.
In this section, automobiles appeared unknown. A small boy on his way to school was stopped for road information. So frightened was he that he started to cry and run away. A little girl took one look at the goggled, mud-covered racers, gave a yell, and started down the road at top speed. Overtaken, she made for the side fields, falling down several times before she was convinced we were not really after her.
It's time once again for a prospective pit stop.
The curved dash runabout was the brainchild of Ransom Eli Olds, who had been in business with his father building stationary gas engines. His first car was steam-powered, and there were Olds electrics before the curved dash came into existence. Bankers generally refused to loan money to an industry they considered fly-by-night. Olds had to seek private investors to stay afloat, investors with their own agenda, forcing Ransom out of the company in 1904.
People who held the purse strings wanted to build bigger, fancier, more luxury cars that cost more money than the little curved dash runabout that sold for $1 a pound. Weighed 650 pounds, sold for $1 a pound. $650, you can't beat that.
They had placed a large emphasis on large cars, and I think Olds probably had somewhat the same vision that Ford did, that he saw that the market for cars was the general public. And of course, after Olds left Olds Motor Works, their emphasis was placed on large cars. And I think that bothered Olds. I think that he would have liked to have stayed with a small car and developed it and improved it as time went on, very similar to what Ford had done.
The door had hardly closed on an exiting Olds when he formed a new company, Rio. His vehicles in later years included this magnificent roadster with a third headlight hooked to the steering and a separate trunk for a golf bag. Rio's more utilitarian vehicles included fire trucks. We seldom hear of the family side of America's industrial giants. Ransom's grandson, R.E. Olds Anderson, shares some memories.
When he was away, when he's traveling, he had his finger on the pulse all the time. When he was home, he was relaxed and just, as I saw him, one of the family. He was distinctive. He, of course, he never smoked, he never drank. He had the original of a letter. All the early automotive pioneers were on it, and their signatures on it, so it was a joint letter of something. But in any event, he went right down the list, and he loves to do things like this because it showed him and it showed the rest of us that there was a better way of living and a longer way of living. So he'd go right on down the list and enumerate all the early automotive pioneers, why they were not with us today, why they had died early, if you will. And it was quite an illuminating thing, and yet he didn't go around preaching abstinence on liquor or smoking or anything like that. He just didn't do it. If somebody else wanted to, that's all right.
Ransom had 2 daughters, and they both were given extensive tours of America's manufacturing might.
Well, she often said she really thought she should have been a boy because she got, and I'll quote her, she got dragged through just about every power plant and machine shop and automobile shop in this part of the United States. And whether she absorbed any of it or not, she never said, but she certainly went through them, believe me.
Ransom Olds had an extreme hatred of horses, probably as the result of the boyhood chore of cleaning out horse stalls. His early advertising copy frequently put the horse at a distinct disadvantage. This graceful and practical automobile will do the work of 6 horses at an average cost of $35 a year for 10,000 miles. Board alone for 1 horse cost $180 a year, so the economy is very evident. The ad went on to assure the prospective buyer that there would be no problems with a new curved dash. The Oldsmobilist has the satisfaction of knowing his machine is always ready. Its working mechanism is simplicity itself. No complications, nothing to go wrong. Operated entirely from the seat, always under instant control, every part easily accessible. Once the car was purchased, some of the instructions were in a suggestive format. Others came as a warning and are laughable by today's knowledge. Even other instructions were intimidating at least, and perhaps a challenge to the owner's common sense. Never fill gasoline reservoir by lamplight. Never leave vehicle with motor running. The inevitable small boy and a slight touch of the clutch lever will cause the carriage to leave you. Don't drive your Oldsmobile 100 miles the first day. You wouldn't drive a green horse 10 miles till you were acquainted with him. Do you know more about a gasoline motor than you do about a horse?
Back to racing with the 2 Olds runabout teams.
At Erie, Old Scout picked up a huge spike while crossing a bridge over a small river. The spike fish-hooked after going twice through the tire, ruining it. We tossed the tire into the river. It probably was the first ever to find a burial place in that stream. Possibly, it is still there.
An early start on May 12th enabled us to cut down Old Scout's lead to such an extent that we overtook Huss loading up with gasoline in Cleveland.
Chicago, Illinois, May 15th. Arrived here 6:30 this morning. McGargle not here. Express Me Omaha large gear pump. One on car no good. Also 1,000 cards. Have lost mine. Dwight B. Huss.
Illinois mud, even when taken at a racing gate, brought our mileage down to 64 miles for the day, and we worked tooth and nail ever since 5 a.m.
From Hellgate to Portland resumes after this prospective pit stop.
The automobile is a machine surrounded by myths and a certain mystique. Folklore becomes fact, might be the appropriate term. Few Americans are aware of Henry Ford's financial flops in the auto industry before he organized Ford Motor Company. Undeserved credit is also given Charles Duryea when his brother did the work. Professor Richard Sharchberg, who just sold his restored curved dash, decided to put the record straight in his book, Carriages Without Horses. Even the title comes with an aura of the supernatural.
Well, Mother Shipton was a self-proclaimed witch who lived most of her life during the reign of Henry VIII. She wasn't one of his wives, but she was a self-proclaimed witch, and she prophesied that carriages without horses shall go, and accidents fill the world with woe. America's first automobile. Well, that's the first thing that I found out was 100% wrong. That was the only thing on which the 2 brothers agreed, incidentally, and that was wrong. An odd irony. The other thing was that they won America's first automobile race, Chicago in 1895. They agreed that they won it, but that was wrong. It wasn't wrong that they won it, but it was wrong that it was the first race. First race in the United States occurred in 1878. The steam-powered vehicles in Wisconsin, the Oshkosh and the Green Bay. They raced from Madison to Green Bay. What was America's first automobile? Well, I had to deal with what the definition was. I contend that an automobile is an automobile is an automobile is an automobile, has nothing to do with the power plant. Therefore, steam vehicles and electric vehicles qualify.
To say car collectors are tenacious is an understatement. They strive for the original and the unique. Legends have developed over a rare car being found in a barn buried under decades of debris and chicken feathers. What may be America's oldest operating automobile was resurrected not from a barn, but about 2 miles from Chicago's Sears Tower. The 1895 Benton Harbor became the property of a proud David Calzo when he paid the back storage bills and began a 3-year restoration project.
It's a genuine race car. It's one of the earliest American race cars. And what's interesting about the vehicle is it was built as an automobile. Even though it looks like a carriage, the Duray in the Smithsonian was built from a carriage and a motor added to it. Its engine is what we call a monosophic. It has no valves. It's all piston operated. And the engine is 5 foot, 3 inches long, 2-cylinder, opposed, and it's liquid cooled, it's water cooled. It has no brakes. There was no application to have brakes put on the vehicle at all. It was just meant to run, and run as fast as it possibly could.
Racing resumes with North America's first transcontinental car race.
After Chicago, we began to learn how bad roads can become. Meanwhile, it had rained every day. We cheered when we saw a patch of blue sky, not a daily occurrence. We would have hallelujah'd had we seen a ray of sunshine, and the rain was working overtime on these Illinois roads. To say that they were bad would not be enough. They were rotten. The only thing that saved them was that they were not gumbo. Had the weather been fair, had it been a dry spell, they would have been good. But now the bottoms had dropped out. But bad as they were merely samples of what lay ahead in Iowa and Nebraska.
Wilton, Iowa, May 18, 1905. At Wilton, 28 miles west Davenport, fording all morning. Percy F. McGargle.
This afternoon at Wilton, 25 miles northwest of Davenport, Old Steady narrowly escaped being wrecked. Coming down Pine Hill under full speed in an effort to get away from us, Old Steady encountered a river with the bridge washed away. Owing to the darkness, the loss of the bridge was not discovered until the car was almost to the brink. By the sudden application of brakes and reverse lever, the car was stopped. The use of blocks and tackle was necessary to finally get the car across the stream.
From Hellgate to Portland resumes after this prospective pit stop.
One of the key things that had to happen with the automobile at first was you had to be an extremely daring, as well to pretty well-to-do type of person to take the risk of mastering this new technology. There were no gas stations, no mechanics, and so you would get a book, sometimes about that thick, that came with the car, giving you the technical specifications, how it ran. I've not seen them, so I don't know the full contents of them, but a colleague of mine is studying these manuals, and many of them were extremely detailed in terms of the technical information. So you had to, there's a famous song, you had to get under, get out, and get under, that described what it was like owning an automobile. You maintained this thing, and if it was going to be running, you had to keep it running.
Johnny O'Connor bought an automobile. He took his sweetheart for a ride on Sunday. Johnny was garbed up in his best Sunday clothes. She nestled close to his side. Things went just dandy till he went down the road. Then something happened to the old machinery. That engine got his coat off when his hat and coat. Everything needed repair. He had to get under, get out and get under to fix his little machine. He was just dying to cuddle his queen, but every minute when he'd begin it, he had to get under, get out and get under. Then he'd get back at the wheel. A dozen times they started to hug and kiss, and then that darned old engine, it would miss, and then he had to get under, get out and get under to fix up his automobile.
Maintaining a new car in the 1990s has been greatly simplified. the first tune-up at 100,000 miles, polymer paints, solid-state ignition, high-mileage tires. These components and more make it easier, if not more economical, to keep a car in good running condition. Specialists have developed in the fields of lubrication, front-end alignment, transmissions, and other disciplines. Such was certainly not the case in 1905. The miserable conditions endured by Old Scout and Old Steady meant suspension systems would undergo tremendous torture, far beyond design limits. Broken springs and bent axles were the order of the day. Enter the village blacksmith, who was capable of crude welding in the 2,000-degree heat of a forge. Iowa has several operating blacksmith shops as historical reminders. Young men learn the basic art at the Living History Farm near Des Moines. In the small farming community of Haverhill is a blacksmith shop dating back to the 1880s. Gene Pippin looks at the blacksmith and the automobile.
Well, many of the blacksmiths had developed by 1905 a feel for internal combustion engines. Their use of them was dedicated toward powering a line shaft, something that ran their power hammers, something that would run a trip hammer like this one over here. So the gas engines, the internal combustion engine, was not something new to them, but of course the automobile, as somebody said, the infernal machine, was something new. As a matter of fact, the blacksmith's business per se was strongly affected by those automobiles that went through Iowa in 1905. But if you were to glance around the shop, you would see many crude-looking handled tools, many of which are hammers. You would see a rack which has an interesting array of tongs hanging on it, all of which are handmade. To the blacksmith, a swedge block was a form die. This piece of cast iron, which is about 4 inches thick and 15 inches square, weighs around 275 to 300 pounds, and it was used by the blacksmith to make square things round by selecting the right size half-round opening here, and by pounding on the top of that, you could shape the iron. And what's more important, you could predictably repeat the shape. But bear in mind now that the blacksmith, by the very nature of his work, is highly innovative. He is very dexterous with his hands, and he does what needs to be done to put something back in running order or condition. There are stories of axles being twisted off, and if replacement parts weren't available, he could shape the ends of them, join them together, and then hammer them out a little thinner and stretch them out a little bit, making a repair possible.
Racing resumes with North America's first transcontinental car race.
Old Steady has run like a top all day. Never missed an explosion. And the way she pulled Stanchfield and myself through mud that hid the hubs from view on more than one occasion has caused the Oldsmobile to rise greatly in my esteem. And with 1/4 of the distance between Portland and New York covered and both cars on even terms, it's still anybody's race.
We began to think we were in Western country. The horses are only half broken and cut up badly upon sighting an auto. The mud all day has been sticky, thick, and black as only Illinois and Missouri can boast. To get through it, we were obliged on several occasions to use block and tackle. The water in our tank boiled, but the engine never faltered, although every one of the 4 wheels were stuck up with mud as to render the spokes invisible. I have seen the wheels many a time with so much gumbo sticking to them that they would weigh 250 to 300 pounds each.
Des Moines, Iowa, May 21st. Arrived last night, overhauling car, leaving at 4, Menlo tonight. Both cars badly off for tires, need money at Omaha. Percy F. McGargle.
It's time once again for a prospective pit stop.
Knowing how the cars are built and knowing how some of these people described what went wrong, it's sometimes difficult to put the two together. There were weak spots in all these cars, and particularly when they're driven over very rough roads where there's a constant amount of vibration, and that vibration will eventually fracture the steel and cause it to crack. In the 1903 trip, there were a lot of people wrote later about some of the problems they had and got things turned around. On the 1905 trip, there might have been a little of that too. Maybe the driver himself really forgot what had happened and recorded it some way different than what did happen. But believe me, those were not strong cars, and they were subjected to a tremendous amount of abuse on those roads, and the fact that they made it at all is a miracle.
Antique car restoration at one time was accomplished by a man with a gigantic box of tools. Years ago, restoration often was restricted to the engine, ignoring the rest of the car. Seldom is that the case anymore with these valuable vehicles. Specialists are now demonstrating expertise in radiators, upholstery, body and fender, transmissions, and other disciplines. A ground-up complete restoration of a curved dash became a film project by master restorer Red Backus in the late 1950s. Although he had restored many cars, Backus sought the counsel of CDO expert George Green. George was considered by many curved dash owners to be the CDO guru. His own car was modified by adding a top for comfort. George and his wife took many trips in the little car, including one clear cross country to Grand Coulee Dam in Washington. A master machinist, Green built his own electric generating plant and proudly showed off a mini operating model to Red's teenage son, Bill. Red's curved dash was literally a basket case. It had spent many years in a creek bed, and the damage was extensive. The parts that could be salvaged were loaded into Red's station wagon, while the chassis and what was left of the body were trailered home. Each phase of the restoration was labor-intensive, requiring not only dedication and expertise, but extreme patience as well. Bill inspected the remains of the original radiator, and his dad spent considerable time with a blowtorch getting the fins back into operation. The wood artillery wheels nearly meant a call for a master wood carver. Heat treating the rims required extensive use of a blowtorch and strong muscles wielding a hammer. The body was a major disappointment. The fragile wood, rotted beyond repair, had to be replaced. Red's patience paid off as he acquired another curved dash body and began refinishing. The engine overhaul was as easy as might be imagined. Bill must have been the envy of every teenage boy in town when he took the car for its first test drive. The body had yet to be painted, but both father and son were eager to get the little car out on the road. The second body was lovingly refinished and the original colors applied. Red and Bill took the fully restored car to the annual Antique Car Show and swap meet at Hershey, Pennsylvania. Their 2 years of effort paid off as Bill outraced some 20 other curved dashes in a drag race. The idle contest was another victory, with a single-cylinder engine barely running at a most respectable 87 revolutions per minute. It was a Triple Crown event for the Backus family, with the car taking top honors for complete restoration.
Let's rejoin Old Scout and Old Steady in serious competition.
The radiator is underneath the car and not very much like a modern automobile radiator. Mud got into it. Finally, it would become so jammed that it would lose its cooling efficiency and the engine would boil over. Then we'd have to get out and get under, as the old song goes, and get busy. The heat of the radiator would bake the mud into the consistency of stone. This we would have to chisel away with a screwdriver, a task that took some time, patience, and skin off our knuckles. Gumbo loves water and grabs all it can as quickly as it can, but it also gives it up readily. The sun drew the water out of the gumbo, dried up the mud, and turned it into kind of iron. Try as hard as we might to avoid those iron-edged and iron-lined ruts, we could neither pull forward or back out. Meanwhile, the rut's edges were tearing the tire sidewalls to pieces. We wore out a set of tires in 90 miles. I am not going to try to describe the fight through the mud belt, one continuous nightmare of mud as it appears looking back now.
Both crews have provided themselves with firearms, but should we encounter any hostile foe, whether he be wild animal or a bad man, the others will have to be able to shoot straighter than I can with the big .38 caliber revolver I purchased for the trip.
We lay over here a day to purchase such supplies as were deemed necessary for the second part of our run. We equipped for the wilder country ahead, taking on extra tanks for desert driving, sand tires, and cooking utensils and firearms. All this raised the weight of our car so that when the machines left Omaha, each had a load of practically 4 full-grown persons. Up to now, the machines had carried as light baggage as possible, each having about 200 pounds weight aboard besides the driver.
Palmer, Nebraska, May 27th. Old Steady spent night Palmer. Raining hard today, rivers high. Percy F. McGargle.
In the great open spaces, the folks looked on the automobile differently than did those in the city. In the east, the folks regarded it largely from a pleasure standpoint. In the west, from the utilitarian. If it was to be worthwhile for them, it had to be improved transportation, not a play toy. So their interest in the race was not sporting, but downright practical. They didn't believe a car could cover the greater distances out there or be able to negotiate their rough roads, which it had to do to be worthwhile in their eyes, and they wanted to be personally shown. In addition, practically none of them had seen an automobile. Many had hardly heard of them. When we stopped, their interest otherwise asserted itself. They examined it in detail. Some of the more daring would ask to sit in that thar contraption. They asked innumerable questions. It was hard to make some believe we had come this far from New York.
Skepticism about the motor vehicle and public roads in the country ran high among America's farmers. Rural America had to be convinced. Centuries of dependence on horses and wagons was not to be overcome in an instant. Farmers who harbored a strong bias against anything originating in cities were a tough sell. No doubt this sales pitch was an early demonstration of the cliche, "I'm from the government. I'm here to help you."
Using some interesting techniques, they ran something called Good Roads trains that toured the country, stopping at every station, doing a demonstration of some kind. Often it was just maybe to have people walk through the cars that they had that showed model equipment and how different roads could be built and pictures before and after of what roads look like. There's other kinds of grassroots programs emerging from several different quarters, but these federal engineers played a significant role in building support. They argued that what they were about was convincing the public of the value of good roads. Farmers were very much afraid that a good roads movement meant bigger hits out of their pocketbook. The basic arrangement that held then, and you'll still see it in many communities when they do sidewalks, for example, the assumption is a property owner benefits from the improvement and he's going to pay for it. And so farmers looking at a good roads movement feared that they would pay the price for those better roads that people were agitating for. The arguments ran the gamut from economic. It would be cheaper to move things to market, farm to market roads are what they were calling for. But they also made a series of arguments that they couched in democratic terms. Farmers could now get to town to vote, for example, so you could participate in government. But another element of the democratic argument was farmers could also participate in the consumer society that was beginning to emerge. And a couple of historians have pointed out that one of the biggest boosts for rural free delivery was the Sears Roebuck catalog. So that now farmers wouldn't have to go to town, but rather stuff could be delivered to them if you had better roads for mailmen. And finally, there was a moral argument. Access to education, access to the kind of a life that a person in town could enjoy, a farmer could also enjoy. So all these arguments are beginning to be put in place by federal engineers through county fair demonstrations, through pamphlets, through a publication program. All these efforts really designed to convince people around the country that roads were necessary for their existence.
Back to racing with the two curved dash teams.
Despite our hard trip, both Stanchfield and myself are enjoying excellent health. In fact, I think I've gained about 3 pounds on the trip thus far, and as our car left New York carrying some 40 pounds more live weight than our rival, if this increase keeps on, we shall be sadly handicapped by the time Portland's reached.
Old Scout so far has had what advantage either has developed since leaving New York. Each of us is betting on himself to win, and the events of the race up to date only make the interest in the outcome greater. The cars are perfectly matched and often run side by side for hours, neither driver being able to gain an advantage. From here on, the staying qualities of the crews and the luck will be an important factor as to who gets into Portland first.
Fremont, Nebraska, May 25th. Both cars at Fremont tonight. High water and bridges out. Percy F. McGargle.
Both crews left Fremont at 8 o'clock this morning and followed the Union Pacific Railway to Columbus, where we had dinner. Occasionally, we ran into towns where some citizens owned an automobile. We were still the center of interest, but you can gamble the local automobilists were invariably on hand with his car to share the glory.
Whenever we stop our car, it's at once surrounded by an enthusiastic crowd of spectators who continue to stare at the mud-stained, battered Oldsmobile until we eventually haul out of town. One motherly old woman who passed us as we were working on our car exclaimed, "You poor fellows, I'm awfully sorry for you."
Grand Island, Nebraska, May 27th. Old Steady goes through bridge. Both axles bent, springs broken, can repair damage by morning. Percy F. McGargle.
Midway of this stretch, we met a farmer. We were more than hub deep in mud then, but somehow making progress. The farmer warned us against further effort. He earnestly assured us we could not go on and cited as proof that a horse and buggy had dropped into quicksand just ahead of us and had never been found. He had us fully convinced. We helped him pull down a stretch of his fence so that we could detour through his property around the horse and buggy graveyard in the road. I guess the farmer is still shaking his head at our apparent foolishness and bullheadedness. Road machines in the West differ from those in the East, where 2 or 4 horses haul them. Here, 16 are attached. The same goes for farm implements. Here, the farmer does not follow a single plow hauled by 1 or 2 horses, but on a 4 to 6 furrow machine hauled by 4 or 8 horses. The inhabitants all through this section are watching the race with interest and take pains to inform the occupants of the rear car just how far in advance the other machine is. The horses all through Iowa cut up badly upon the approach of an automobile. One old farmer for whom we had stopped our car to get his horse and mule combination passed was highly indignant that an automobile from New York is using my road, as he termed it. Do you know the law in this state compels you fellows to run your machine into the field until we can pass? When we informed him we knew of no such law and that our automobile was not afraid of his team, he wanted to lick the 2 of you, as he put it.
From Hellgate to Portland resumes after this prospective pit stop.
The domestic vehicle industry has been a mainstay in the American economy for decades. Years ago, a General Motors chairman's definition of this impact was improperly perceived. Charles Wilson was quoted as saying, "What's good for General Motors is good for the country." There was a hue and cry from some quarters, with charges of arrogance and self-importance being the most polite. At the time of Wilson's statement, 1 out of every 4 jobs depended on Detroit staying in business. Few people put the statement in that context. Industry executives have had 2 major concerns: selling today's vehicle and the design and engineering of tomorrow's car or truck. Industry history had a low priority. For some, a career in the industry means researching history after you retire. Ken Self typifies that stance. His transportation career began as a mechanic in an Idaho bus depot. When he retired, he was the chief executive officer and board chairman of Freightliner, a leading heavy and custom truck manufacturer. Self became one of the founding members of the Pacific Northwest Truck Museum, and he compares today's 18-wheeler with the curved dash 7-horsepower engine.
The most common or popular engine would be 440 horsepower, and that would be pulling a gross load of the max of, say, 105,000 at 65 miles an hour. But the 7.5 horsepower, you almost have to start at the other end of the scale at walking speed.
Self's career was capped with a Michigan trip to be inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame.
It used to be that only deceased members could be inducted into the Hall of Fame. But those rules were changed, I believe, in '81 or in the early '80s anyway, so that it now provides that for any executive that is completely retired from the industry qualifies to be inducted.
2 Oldsmobile employees with nearly a century of service came out of retirement to establish the Olds History Center and write a book on the company's first 100 years.
Actually, the automobile industry as a whole has never been too interested in its own history.
Everything with a new model year?
Yes, the interest was building new models, trying to get rid of if you had any left over, taking care of your customer. Service is a very important part. But the history that brought us to that point didn't seem to be of much interest. Besides, there was no general procedure on what to keep. We did run onto an original stock certificate that has 2 signatures of Mr. Olds, where Mr. Olds signed over 250 shares of stock, indicating he had lost control of the company. He needed more money to expand, so every time he got money from he had to give you his stock. So he, little by little, he lost control of the company that he had formed in 1897.
Jim Walkinshaw, a curved dash owner himself, is the other partner in the History Center operation. Trying to sort historic fact from legend and myth has been a major challenge.
Good many times when you get information and wonder if it is correct, unless you put yourself back into that particular time frame, 1905, 1915, or whenever, you have a difficult time in trying to really ascertain if it's right or wrong. In good many cases, information is perceived as correct. It is somebody's feeling of the time, and it may or may not be correct, and unless you really feel the time a little bit yourself, you have a hard time just determining if that is correct. But I really think the most fascinating part of that whole trip is getting through the great open, vast expanses of the plains and over the mountains without having some kind of a major disaster or getting lost. It's just an undertaking. It is very difficult for people to believe and understand and put themselves back 90 years ago when that all happened and try and think about trying to cross the states.
Racing resumes with North America's first transcontinental car race.
I killed my first rattlesnake just before reaching Lodgepole. He was a whopper, measuring more than 6 feet and having 7 buttons to his rattle.
We have covered the 1,700 miles from New York in 14 days, record-breaking time when the condition of the roads is considered. Ahead of us lie 2,000 miles of almost unknown roads, much of it located miles from the nearest railroad.
Kearney, Nebraska, May 28th. Old Steady made 50 miles through continuous rain today, worked all night to repair. Percy F. McGargle. North Platte, Nebraska, May 29. Arrived North Platte 6 p.m. Roads rotten. Huss.
From Hellgate to Portland resumes after this prospective pit stop.
Other things that were missing as part of this whole program of getting the automobile in place were registration, all the kinds of insurance. Initially, it cost an arm and a leg to insure an automobile because the insurance companies had no record on what it would cost. And so the auto companies tried to convince them it was like a horse and buggy, and which cost $25 a year. But the initial policies ran $100 to $250 a year, so that's a lot of money to put out just for the insurance. The states had to worry about licenses and all kinds of legislative procedures. And, of course, the roads are part of the thing that has to be put in place, too.
Since vehicle registration, license plates, and driver's licenses were not yet reality, the industry had free rein in marketing, including appealing to the emotions of boys. Olds Motor Works was quick to grab this concept with its marketing campaign aimed at what was defined by the company as live boys. The advertising copy speaks for itself. Far more than just an ad, this publication ran a full 12 pages. Imagine, if you will, a boy appearing at your front door, bound and determined to make you his next customer, not to win a contest by selling magazines or some other low-priced item, but breathlessly pleading, "Want to buy a car? Come on, mister, buy a car. Please buy a car. Help me win the contest. Would you please, mister?" Boys would go to sleep with dreams of winning a curve dash of their very own, and the company knew how to magnify those dreams. The copy extolled Olds' reliability, triumphs, dependability, and speed. Despite extensive research, the contest results remain unknown.
Let's rejoin Old Scout and Old Steady in serious competition.
Two such mud-bespattered vehicles as the Olds pair were never before seen here. Not a line of paint could be discovered on either machine, while the little 28-inch wheels had every one of their 12 spokes so crusted with mud that they resembled the wheels of a circus bandwagon. The crews of each car are attired in leather, canvas, and corduroy, and they, like the cars, are covered with mud and show evidence of the hard run.
Cozad, Nebraska, May 30th. Old Steady spent night Cozad. Roads heavy, water high, raining. Percy F. McGargle. Julesburg, Colorado, May 30th. Arrived Julesburg, 7 p.m. D.B. Huss.
Our tires suffered more from the run today than during all the 1,500 miles previously traveled. The front tires are now worn through both rubber and canvas on either side, and our rear set has fared little better.
Sutherland, Nebraska, May 31st. Old Steady here last night, stuck twice yesterday. Roads improving. Percy F. McGargle.
From Hellgate to Portland resumes after this prospective pit stop.
The fantasy of winning the Indy 500 or a Grand Prix event begin almost as soon as children pick up their first toy car and start making engine sounds, faster and louder. As adults, we realize these fantasies are beyond financial reality for most of us. This was just as true in 1903 as it is today. Industrial giants and millionaires became involved in car racing. Among them, telephone inventor Alexander Graham Bell and the founder of Standard Oil and the Rockefeller fortune, John D. Rockefeller. They temporarily left their vocations to take on the role of race promoters with the first Florida race at the ocean's edge. Starting at Ormond Beach, the event gave Daytona the name the birthplace of speed. Ransom Olds quickly built his entry, the Pirate. Powered by a two-cylinder engine, the car set a record of almost 55 miles an hour. Although it ran in a couple of other races later that year, the car's fate is unknown. Even the plans were lost or destroyed. These grainy black and white pictures were the only illustrations used to build a replica. Olds dealer and car collector Steve Moskowitz gleefully took on the challenge. The Pirate replica was taken to Florida for the 1997 Daytona 500.
Now, the other day here on Thursday, Ned Jarrett drove this car for CBS TV, and hopefully we'll see it aired during the Daytona 500. And Ned's one heck of a race car driver, but he only got 25 miles out of this thing. And you know how us guys are, and I did a little racing myself. We're all a little macho. We got to have a race here today. What's a race car without a race?
Oval track racers, dragster drivers, sports car speeders, and men long retired from the sport of speed were invited to test the little car on the Florida beach. Oregon's Hirsch McGriff came to national fame winning the Mexican Pan American Road Race in a 1950 Olds. McGriff probably holds the record for being the oldest active racer in the country. He's still in competition and nearly 70 years old.
When was the last time you were on a racing vehicle like that?
That's my first time ever on something like that because, you know, I'm not an open wheel driver. Right. You know, I got to have fenders and a roof. And that's why I've had a chance to go to India a few times and over the past years. And I thought, well, as soon as you put a roof and fenders on, I'll drive for you, you know. But no, it was a thrill. It's hard for me to imagine him building that car in 1903, you know, that long ago. But last time I did go down the beach was in a car that is fast, was 1954.
is not your father's or your grandfather's.
No, it isn't. It's different than any automobile I've ever driven. They got the pedals all mixed up. I thought I was giving it the gas and I was putting the brake on so we couldn't get it going. But no, it's pretty wild. I've driven cars 200 mile an hour that were more stable than that thing is at 20.
I can understand that 54 miles an hour was the record was set back in 1903. That had to be a terrific speed. We were doing maybe 20, 25 miles an hour here today, but then you could feel every pebble of sand up there and whatnot because the old buggy springs just weren't doing what they're supposed to, I don't think.
It seems like you need a great deal more hand-eye coordination than... There's a lot more involved than you would think, you know. With one cylinder on a thing, you'd think it'd just be, you know, natural, but there's a lot of things going on in there that if you're not accustomed to it. It takes a little while just to get everything in sync. I'm sticking to what I do. It's a little too complicated. This is way too complicated.
You know, I'm not bragging, but I did win 40 of these big NASCAR races, 2-point championships. But I think after today, I know exactly how Barney Oldfield feels. I got to drive the 03 down the beach, and it sprayed oil on my beautiful Oldsmobile jacket, and I thought it was mosquitoes.
This is fun, but it's, the biggest kick I've had today is watching all these great ex-race car drivers drive this. That's more thrill than even driving this car. It was great to see guys like Herschel McGriff with a big smile on their face, and Irv and Eddie and all those guys. They had just as much fun driving this as I do. So that's neat for me to see. That's all that makes all the hard work pay off.
How long did it take you to learn to drive it?
I'm still not sure I know how to drive it.
If an American who sells cars for a living has a bit of a problem driving the replica, imagine the trepidation and fear of new drivers at the turn of the century. Tires running against revolving steel drums must have been sheer cacophony with what passed for driver education. Steering was still self-taught. Driving a curve dash, even today, is more difficult than it seems. Actor James Garner, who is a familiar figure in racing circles and at the Indy 500, had problems getting a curve dash underway in an Oldsmobile Centennial film. Working the shifter presented a challenge, and there were a number of false starts before Garner got the car moving smoothly. He appeared more at ease in a later scene with Oldsmobile's latest model.
Let's rejoin Old Scout and Old Steady in serious competition.
Losing Old Steady gave added flavor to our race. Up to now, we had traveled practically together. While ours was a transcontinental race, it was also one to demonstrate reliability. But the rules governing the race had not specified staying together. The only arrangement between us was that if one ran across the other in difficulties, he would stop, help out, and go on. We traveled together simply because we could not become separated. We followed the road several miles, and it finally disappeared in some sand hills. We were completely lost for over an hour, but finally struck off across some cornfields and wound up in a farmyard. Game is abundant throughout Nebraska: jackrabbits, cottontails by the score, quail, wild doves, prairie chickens, and many large birds of which I am not familiar are found in numbers.
All of us worked in water and mud nearly waist deep. My rubber boots were not nearly high enough to escape wet feet, as the water simply poured in over the top. I was able to pour several quarts out of each boot after nearly an hour's work pulling the boots off. The other boys, clad in low shoes and leggings, made no effort to escape with dry feet, and all were soaked within a few minutes.
May 30th, Julesburg. This town rests partly in two states, Colorado and Wyoming. The going today was better, though we still had an abundance of mud, as deep and troublesome as in the past days. But the country grew more interesting as we went along. It developed that we were to leave the last of our mud here. The gumbo days were at an end. However, you can form some idea of the condition of the roads when you consider it took us 2.5 hours to cover the last 8 miles. Deep in the sand, Old Scout gave a few grunts and stopped. As we had carried sand tires, we thought this was a good chance to test their efficiency. After the tires were on, we started, and the way Old Scout performed with them was a wonder. And when Old Steady finally faded away into the horizon, it was the last our crew ever saw of her. Thereafter, we made nightly inquiries. We were told Old Steady was just behind or a couple of days behind. We knew she was not ahead, as the gasoline stores arranged for us were untouched at each supply point when we arrived.
Sutherland, Nebraska, May 31st. Old Steady here last night, stuck twice yesterday. Roads improving. Percy F. McGargle.
It's time once again for a prospective pit stop.
Many, if not most, of the automobile manufacturers built trucks, and the Olds Motor Works quickly responded to business demands for delivery vehicles. This is the only known surviving Olds truck. Commonly referred to as a pie wagon, this particular unit is affectionately dubbed Oregon's own Olds. The truck was leaving Portland for its Michigan birthplace the day we visited. Just before the pie wagon was loaded, we spoke with John Kallstrom, a stickler for detail in his restoration and collection of more than 24 vehicles. Restoration meant some 200 hours of John's time, and he admits watching the truck leave could be emotional.
I guess I might have a couple of tears. Yeah. My wife, she thinks I should keep it, but I tell her, what the heck, we can't drive them all. Got 2 speeds ahead and 1 reverse. It's got 16 horsepower, single-cylinder engine. Been a lot of people want to buy it, and there's been quite a bit of show work with it, where people want to get pictures of it to use for something, you know. I never like to take it out too much because it's too dangerous to drive on a modern highway.
When new, the pie wagon sold for some $850. Oldsmobile bought it back for a reported $45,000.
And they made an offer, and they come and looked at the car, and they says, well, I can see why you wanted more money. So they said that everything I said to them was what was in the car.
And the truck now has a place of honor in the R.E. Olds Museum in Lansing.
And it might be a little better when it was new than it was when it was new, too. I don't know.
Back to racing with the 2 Olds runabout teams.
Lodgepole, Nebraska, May 31st. Here tonight, Cheyenne tomorrow, if no rain. Killed 2 rattlesnakes today. Percy F. McGargle.
That ill feeling against Ottawists that one encountered so frequently among the farmers in the East is lacking out here, and every farmer met is your friend, no matter how badly you scare his horses. We encountered vast tracts of original prairie land without fencing of any kind, and every few miles we found herds of cattle, usually looked after by 1 or 2 cowboys mounted on fiery little ponies. The riders, as a rule, rather enjoy the antics of their animals as they buck and pitch at the sight of our automobile and wave to us gaily as we pass them. As we go west, the little square wooden houses are becoming scarce, and those of sun-dried brick are taking their places. We were to have many odd experiences in Wyoming, but here we ran across the finest roads in the West, made the best time, and encountered the fewest difficulties. The roads were no better than elsewhere, though the terrain was different. To us, they were a delight. We had come to believe the world was one of mud only, mud everywhere, on wheels, tires, clothes, shoes. With every 2 steps you took, 1 fell into mud. Now in this gumbaless country, it was like stepping from the dark into the daylight when we hit the road at Cheyenne.
We arrived at Laramie, Wyoming, Friday, June 2nd, thus reaching the summit of the Pacific Slope. Snow-covered mountains were in plain view, and the wind coming from their direction very strongly reminded us of the icy blasts encountered on the streets of Buffalo or Rochester on a winter's day when the wind is blowing off the lake.
Laramie, Wyoming, June 3rd. Old Steady left Laramie 3 o'clock. Spent night on prairie. Percy F. McGargle.
Huss and Old Scout had the brakes going their way. The team's lead over Old Steady continued to grow. Strangely enough, neither driver made any great note of visiting the Ames Monument between Cheyenne and Laramie. This stone monolith celebrates the railroad crossing the Continental Divide. With the mud and gumbo behind him, Huss surveyed the Rocky Mountains with an expression of concern. In retracing the race route, we made every attempt to keep our camera steady. The roughness of the terrain, a lack of shock absorbers, meant camcorder and crew were bounced around with every turn of the wheel. This short clip will give you an idea of the bouncing and jarring the two crews felt as they headed west. As Old Scout's lead increased, Huss and Weigel were able to spend some time away from the rough ride. Huss even managed to shoot a rabbit for dinner, apparently with an automatic pistol. His love of the outdoors was a major avocation, according to his son, John.
Well, my dad was a great hunter. He just loved to hunt. He could go duck hunting. He had a duck skiff, and he had all of the decoys necessary to hunt. And at the drop of the hat, he and his pal, Irving Bacon, would take a trip either to Grove's Isle, or he would go to the flats up at above the 6th grade lake in Detroit. And there they would hunt ducks. It wasn't anything for my brother and I to pick feathers off 20 ducks. A real bushel basket full of feathers.
Back to racing with the two Olds runabout teams.
Soda Springs, Idaho, June 6th. Old Scout arrived Soda Springs at 7:30 OK. D.B. Huss.
Since getting up into the mountains, I had wondered how so much snow could remain on the ground, but about 10 miles out of Elk Mountain, I no longer wondered, for we ran into as fierce a snowstorm as one experiences in the east in midwinter. It lasted only for a few moments, but we were not prepared for snowstorms, and with the wind whistling around our heads and the snow blowing in flurries about us, we felt the cold keenly.
For several days, we have been wearing our revolvers in plain sight, with our belts bristling with cartridges, as do many riders we meet along the road. For some days also, we have been meeting many parties traveling in prairie schooners to and from the east. These schooners, usually a single wagon drawn by 2 or 4 horses or mules with 1 or 2 small ponies and a cow tied behind, are visible for miles. Their big white canvas bow tops glistening in the sunshine, and we often pass as many as half a dozen of them traveling together.
It was almost impossible to follow the trail after leaving Elk Mountain, and we lost it once or twice. Finally, however, we succeeded in working our way out of the mountain wilderness, sticking to the tracks of the Union Pacific until we reached the coal mining town of Hanna, a place of about 1,000 inhabitants, 1 hotel, several saloons, and 2 or 3 stores. Here, we replenished our supply of gasoline, paying 45 cents a gallon.
From Hellgate to Portland resumes after this prospective pit stop.
The internal combustion engine at the beginning of the 20th century had strong competition with electric and steam power plants, both of which Olds Motor Works found lacking in one respect or another. Nevertheless, there were an estimated 200 companies building steam-powered cars. The Stanley Steamer may be the most well-known, but the Stanley brothers sold their firm to Locomobile shortly after the turn of the century. In Boise, Richard Gasparati has 2 identical 1901 Locomobiles.
They had a removable deal that they pulled out of your burner, and they made a fire of either fuel which they drained from their tank, or they made a fire from leaves and kindling and everything in the ditch alongside the road, and they got it till it was cherry red, put it back in there and turned on the fuel, and they hoped that they got it in there before it got cold.
Our trip into the Idaho sagebrush started calmly enough, but excitement was soon added. A fuel leak caused a minor flashback and fire, but Richard said that was no problem. As the boiler got up to pressure, we heard its progress.
When it does that, it's working right.
A close-up shot of the glass water gauge became a disaster, with the gauge breaking and steam headed in all directions. Fortunately, no one got burned, and we enjoyed the afternoon.
Let's rejoin Old Scout and Old Steady in serious competition.
Ever since leaving New York, we'd been using number 4 Mobil oil for both cylinder and transmission with excellent results, but we neglected to stop at the railroad station in Laramie for the supply shipped there, and running short of oil, we bought a small quantity of so-called gas engine oil at a store. When we reached Rawlins, we received a consignment of Mobil oil and unthinkingly poured it in on top of the other. When we had gone about 5 miles, the car faltered and stopped. We worked most of Tuesday night and until 10 o'clock Wednesday morning, cleaning out the engine.
The everlasting sagebrush throughout this country was one of the worst nuisances we had to contend with on the whole trip. Remember, out here we were traveling across lots as often as we traveled on what went for roads. On such jaunts, we skinned over acres of sagebrush. The tough weeds would pound against our radiator, mashing the fins down and knocking the tubes out of shape. That was bad enough, but much too often the drive chain links would catch the fibrous sagebrush and drag it into the differential housing, packing the gears so they could not turn. Something would have to give, so the axle would turn a quarter around in its shackle fastenings. The rear wheels would be locked, killing the motor and bringing the car to such a sharp halt that we would almost be pitched over the dash. When we hit this desert, our regular tires just bit into the sand, and within a minute we were down to the hubs. Nearby was an Indian reservation. Some of the braves made their living pulling stranded wagons out of this same sand. They had been watching us, and within minutes were on hand with their ponies, ropes, and even provisions prepared for a sum to pull us out and tote us across the deserts. We had no such intention. We dragged out the jack and hoisted Old Scout up, a wheel at a time, and put the sand tires on. This contrivance gave us a tread 10 inches wide, whereas our regular tires were hardly 2 inches wide. The Indians, meanwhile, standing by, watched us and grunted their doubts. Then we gave the Indians a few cents to pull the car out of the hole, started the motor, and off we went, much to the Indians' disgust.
Poor Stanchfield collapsed with mountain fever at Diamondville on June 10th, and we had to put him to bed in the Daily Hotel. When we reached Diamondville, he could stand it no longer, and after getting him to bed, I spent the rest of the day looking up a doctor. He was one of those nervous little men filled with his own importance and knowing it all at a glance. He looked Bart over, and then he said his bill was $10 and wanted to know who was going to pay it. Stanchfield has a bad attack of mountain fever, aches in every bone and muscle, has a burning fever with intermittent cold chills, and was most miserable when I left him to push on alone. We are nearly 8,000 feet above sea level here. The fever has not bothered me yet, but I shall breathe easier after passing Fossil, for from there down the altitude lessens with almost every mile.
We were victims of an after-nightfall mishap. At night, we used an acetylene searchlight. I say we used the searchlight, but I should add, only when we could. We could not always get the supplies for it. This night, we fell into a badger hole while dodging another. We bent our front axle badly and drove like that until midnight when we located a blacksmith shop. Lots of persuasion and a $10 bill finally routed out the blacksmith who lived above the shop. The three of us took the axle off, started the forge going, and got things fixed up in pretty good shape.
McAmmon, Idaho, June 13th. Old Steady here tonight. Stanchfield fully recovered. Roads very rough. Percy F. McGargle.
From Hellgate to Portland resumes after this prospective pit stop.
As the old question goes, what's wrong with this picture? Take a moment or two to inspect as we tell you about curved-to-dash ownership in the 1990s. There are more than 300 of the little cars still in existence, with about 125 of that number being in foreign countries. Australia, the Scandinavian countries, England, and others are home to curved dash runabouts. Owning a curved dash was a high priority for Dick Miller, who has had his car for more than 42 years.
Well, about 20 years ago or so, I realized the car needed some reworking, and frankly, I couldn't afford to redo it. So I had the silly idea to decorate it to look like Old Steady. I picked Old Steady because Old Scout is supposed to be owned by Oldsmobile. So we painted the sign on the side, and we made an extra oil storage tank for the rear, like shows in the pictures.
built a box on the back and a little railing. And then we found a lot of used 3/4 inch rope and wrapped it around all the headlights in front, so there's really a big wad of rope up there. And then we took it out intentionally and drove it through the mud. So it looks like a car that's really been someplace.
Restoration and use of an antique automobile is no longer just a man's recreation, but has evolved into recreational and cultural outings for the entire family. Most antique car tours take place in the spring and summer months, although some hardy souls are known to venture out in the dead of winter. Dick Neller's wife, Sue, was the first curator of the R.E. Olds Museum in Lansing and is a big promoter of antique car tours.
Cars are one of the few things that has been preserved by individual hobbyists, like the groups that are here today. They have preserved the cars. Many other kinds of artifacts has been preserved by museums and other places, but car museums were rare until 30 years ago, probably.
Did you find out what's wrong in the picture? Well, the sign painter obviously was semi-literate and misspelled Oregon.
Racing resumes with North America's first transcontinental car race.
Every time we forded a stream, and often we forded them a dozen times in a day, we first had to remove the batteries, place them on the seat, shove the car across, then replace the batteries. Each time also we would be compelled to drain the engine. Muddy water would seep into it in the stream, and this we would blow out by opening the pitcock and cranking the motor. This became just ordinary things in our lives, but they ate into our time, energy, and patience.
The different altitudes did not affect me until nearing Soda Springs when, after pumping up one of our tires, I suffered from a violent bleeding of the nose. The slightest exertion causes a person to pant violently, while harder work causes one not accustomed to the mountains to bleed at the nose, mouth, and ears.
But Old Scout had a narrow escape. We were on a very steep hill, so steep in fact that it was impossible to hold the car, and we shot down the hill and over a 12-foot embankment into a ditch. Our good luck was that the ditch was dry. Weigel and I had a hard time getting the car out and were surprised to find it still hanging together. The front axle was so badly bent that the wheels were on a slant of 15 degrees. We drove 30 miles in that condition to Pocatello, where we spent part of the night and Wednesday forenoon getting things straightened. We found we had one advantage with our bent axle. The wheels fitted the 60-inch track, while before, ours being 56, would not.
It's time once again for a prospective pit stop.
Here's a trivia question. How many different automobile brands have been produced in the United States? Foreign manufacturers with American assembly plants are not included. Remember, we're counting brands, not model names. We'll give you the answer a little later on. The early days of the domestic vehicle industry were amazing. While large companies had engineers and designers, shade tree mechanics, inventive geniuses, and garage tinkerers made major efforts to transform their ideas from concept to cars on the road. As new cars were introduced, along came inventors and designers with what they felt were better ideas. Thus, the automotive aftermarket was born. It is unclear which came first, the supply or the demand. In any case, one accessory is still with us today: custom wheels. Many early cars had spoke wheels that originated on bicycles. Car owners were eager for something more substantial to clearly demonstrate their car was not a bicycle with an engine attached as an afterthought. Thus came the business of wooden artillery wheels. While machinery did some of the assembly, the finish on each spoke was still labor-intensive, with sandpaper being liberally applied. Supply houses grew like weeds, offering dozens of brands of goggles, tools, and motoring apparel. Long before closed bodies were standard, the need for weather protection was evident, a need that was met in Oregon by a former bicycle supply house. Ballou and Wright offered storm aprons to fit all automobiles with holes for as many as 5 protruding heads.
Back to racing with the two Olds runabout teams.
Nampa, Idaho, June 14th. We are detained by slight accident until morning. Both are well. D.B. Huss. Pocatello, Idaho, June 15th. Old Steady leaves here for Boise, 2:30 today. Percy F. McGargle.
In Idaho, as in Wyoming and Oregon, the roads were alike. 2 ruts, perhaps gullies would be better, cut by wagon wheels, between which was a ridge of turf, often 20 inches high. We drive along for a half mile when the axle and differential would catch on this ridge and lift the car high and dry. We would have to back up for 3/4 of a mile sometimes before we could get out of the rut and start back on the side of the road. Had our car the clearance of a wagon, it would have saved us many bumpy rides alongside the road. June 15th, Ontario, Oregon. Met here by Mr. Abbott, who gave us all the information possible about Oregon roads, and it was meager to say the least. Yesterday, we met the chauffeur of a large touring car from Portland, which had come up from the Dalles 100 miles by boat, there being no good road that way. He reported incredibly bad roads until he struck the one we were to follow. From that point, he came along with little trouble. This encouraged us, and we prepared to leave for Burns in high spirits.
The ride from Boise to Ontario, Oregon was most disagreeable. Mile after mile, Old Steady's path was marked by clouds of fine alkali dust that completely enveloped us and made breathing difficult. Many ruralites who endeavored to get a good view of their first automobile were disappointed. After traveling some 17 miles, we were compelled to lose 4 hours waiting for a bridge-building gang to repair the bridge over the Little Boise River before we could cross and take the Riverside Ferry over Snake River for Ontario, both rivers being too deep to ford. When we reached the ferry, Mr. McConnell, the ferryman, was busy with his farm work, and his wife ferried us across. The river was high and the current swift, so it was but a few minutes before we were safely landed on the Oregon shore.
June 17th, Paulina. Left Burns at 11 a.m. The weather was clear and fine for driving, and we are confident we will be able to make the difficult crossing of the Cascades successfully.
From Hellgate to Portland resumes after this prospective pit stop.
There was one other motor vehicle manufactured by Olds, but this was not a car or a truck. Matter of fact, it didn't even run on the highway. The Olds railroad inspection car was part of the company's line in 1904. What was your estimate on the number of different brands of cars built in the United States? Here's a hint. Some may have only built a very few, while other brands had but a prototype. We won't name them all, but alphabetically they begin with Abbott and conclude with Zip. The total, more than 1,500 authenticated brands. Although he had no connection with Olds Motor Works, songwriter Gus Edwards soon caught the attention of the company and the nation with his composition In My Merry Oldsmobile. The car people did not hesitate to capitalize on using the song at every opportunity. We'll play disc jockey for the moment, introducing a vocal by Miss Jo Stafford. Her husband, Paul Weston, conducts the orchestra.
Young Johnny Steele has an Oldsmobile. He loves the dear little girl. She is the queen of his gas machine. She has his heart in a whirl. Now when they go for a spin, you know, she tries to learn the also. He lets her steer while he gets her ear and whispers soft and low. Come away with me, Lucille, in my merry Oldsmobile. Down the road of life we'll fly, automobile, you and I. To the church we'll swiftly steal, then our wedding bells will peal. You can go as far as you like with me in my merry Oldsmobile.
Racing resumes with North America's first transcontinental car race.
The most dangerous race challenge was about to be tackled by Huss, Weigel, and Old Scout. Unlike most roads and routes in the West, the Santiam Wagon Road was carved out of a trail going from west to east to provide a freight route serving central and eastern Oregon. Originally known as the Willamette Valley and Cascade Mountain Military Road, the route was planned in 1864, but financial problems and questions of corruption delayed completion. Finally, the route was given a patent and signed by United States President Ulysses S. Grant. Both Huss and McGargle found the road extremely steep, with grades of more than 40% presenting major problems.
June 19th at Sweet Home, Santiam Pass. I believe ours was the first car to negotiate the Santiam Pass through the Cascades and traverse 2 ranges. The grades at that time were extremely steep, the trail having been blasted out just enough to allow a wagon to travel it. It was very rocky. While stagecoaches with large wheels could get through, we found it almost impossible in many places to climb over the huge boulders and had to pile rocks to even things up. It was a terrible place to take a car. It was steep, rough, treacherous, and dangerous and difficult, even for horses and wagons to make the journey. Drivers would lock the wheels of their wagons to brake them down the inclines. We accomplished it in this fashion. I drove the car. Weigel got out with a leather bag containing our numerous heavy tools. I would force the car up the grade to its limit, and just before the motor threatened to die, Weigel, who followed closely, would thrust the bag of tools under our rear wheel. We would halt the car for a breathing spell and then resume. How many times Weigel threw that bag under the wheels, we probably never could have counted. On the way down, we developed a new form of brake. We cut down a rather large fir tree, dragged it in position behind the car, to which we tied it with ropes. Weigel got aboard the tree and I sat in the car guiding it down the mountains. Weigel and his tree coasting behind me a distance of 7 miles. We negotiated the pass in this laborious fashion in 6 hours. I was later told it took a horse and wagon 2 days to accomplish the same thing. I am sure all doubted our truthfulness when we said we had done it in 6 hours. We had one experience I never want again. Suddenly rounding a curve one morning, we saw an immense rock in the way. To the right was a sheer wall running up hundreds of feet, while on the left was a ravine 300 feet deep. We couldn't go over it. So we took a chance and tried to get around on the open side. There happened to be some sand there. We slipped and our left wheel slid off and spun around in space. If we had slipped a few inches more, we would never have finished the race. We climbed out, chipped the rock away, got our block and tackle, and in an hour we were on our way again.
Ontario, Oregon, June 21st. Old Steady left here at 6:30 tonight for Westfall. Percy F. McGargle.
The exhausted team made their way up the Willamette Valley with no major mishaps. Reporters were present at almost every mile between Salem and Portland, and a crowd of thousands greeted the automotive pioneers in the City of Roses. The team arrived at the Lewis and Clark Exposition less than an hour before the National Good Roads Convention was to open. Huss, who suffered from flu symptoms, had lost 22 pounds during the 44-day ordeal. After a few days' rest, the men rode home in the luxury of a train. Hello, I'm Ed Whitaker. You would think that the end of the race in 1905 would mean the end of the story. Just the opposite is true. As a matter of fact, there were developments around Hellgate, the little car, and Dwight Huss almost to the end of the 20th century. When Dwight and Old Scout arrived in Portland taking the $1,000 prize, there was another automobile there running around the Lewis and Clark Expo. This was built in Portland. The 1904 Benson was built with a 2-cylinder engine. If you bought a car built in Portland, you wouldn't have to pay those horrible transportation costs to get it in from Detroit or Massachusetts or wherever. In 1906, the car was expanded to a 4-cylinder engine. This beautiful little machine has been faithfully restored by retired longshoreman Walt Rusk.
I have the patent papers on the steering mechanism. This is one of the first cars that ever had a steering wheel in it, and in 1904. And the car is appraised at $100,000, and I keep $100,000 with insurance on it.
Old Steady continued to motor westward despite losing the race. When McGargle and Stanchfield learned of the Old Scout victory, they decided to slow down and go fishing. They arrived in Portland 8 days later. Percy's description of the Santiam Wagon Road Challenge leaves no doubt as to the danger of 7 Mile Hill.
Cache Creek is the eastern end of the toll road, and a big gate with lock and key bars the way until toll is paid. The charges are cattle 10 cents and sheep and hogs 3 cents a head. There might have been some controversy as to the charge for our car, as the gatekeeper was puzzled. We had a 7-horsepower engine, but some of the freighters classified us as road hogs. As such, we were entitled to passage at 3 cents a head. However, The manager of the Willamette Valley and Cascade Mountain Toll Road had arranged for this in advance by sending orders. No toll for Old Scout or Old Steady. There was one little funny incident connected with our mountain running that will bear repeating. We had been advised to be sure and hitch a tree to the rear of our car in descending 7 Mile Hill, as the third mountain in the Cascade Range is known, and we followed instructions to the best of our ability. When we had reached a point as high as we thought possible to attain, we stopped and looked around for a Christmas tree. We soon located one, but had no axe. The nearest approach to this handy instrument was a cold chisel, and we cut our tree with this and a monkey wrench. Then, chaining it to our rear axle, Old Steady had resented the introduction of Santa Claus all along and positively refused to haul Stanchfield, myself, and the Christmas tree to the top. So there was nothing to do but lift the muddy tree into the rig and let it ride. Everything went well until we were descending the 6th mountain range when Old Steady commenced to skid. You who have experienced some skidding on smooth asphalt pavements have no idea of the sensation of a skid down a 50% grade in the Cascade Mountains, 30 miles from the nearest house. Down, down we came, first the front wheels ahead and then the rear. Finally, the front wheels struck a moss-covered rock by the roadside and climbed over. The other front wheel, not to be left behind, followed suit. When we first struck, both Stanchfield and myself were not only thrown out, but pitched bodily clear across the road into the bushes, followed by most of our trappings. The car, suspended by one rear wheel and the right step, which had caught in some bushes, hung over a 200-foot cliff, and Stanchfield and myself, rubbing the mud out of our eyes, sat on the side of the road wondering why it did not go all the way over. A large prairie schooner, carrying a number of men and women, hove in sight about this time, and between the lot of us, we were able to get it back in the road and continue our uncertain descent.
What about Ransom Olds? We can only surmise as to what his attitude might have been when he learned that cars with his name on them made the first trip east to west in North America. There had been a bitter takeover, and Ransom and the money men who now owned Oldsmobile had horrible thoughts about each other. As a matter of fact, a few years later, when Frederick Smith, one of those money men, wrote a series of articles for a Detroit paper about the company's history, he did not even mention Ransom by name. It was time for Ransom and Percy to do some one-upsmanship. Ransom hired Percy to drive a new Rio, not just from New York to Portland, but to make a complete round trip, hopefully returning to New York in time for the auto show, which was a big thing even then. Well, Percy made the trip all right, but it took 10 months to happen. The car got stuck, quicksand, and no end to difficulty, but they did make it back, and that was the first round trip for an automobile in the United States. Old Scout's new home for the next quarter century was to be in Oregon. Portland businessman Henry Wemme, who brought the first automobile into the state, quickly purchased the well-used curved dash. Wemme was not one to take setbacks graciously. That first car he brought to Oregon was the subject of a prolonged battle between Wemme and the railroads. In the end, Wemme won a somewhat dubious victory as the railroad barons came to the realization Wemme had backed them into a corner on freight costs. Wemme eventually sold Old Scout to an Olds dealer in Portland, and the car frequently participated in Rose Festival parades and other civic events. Lawmakers in every state soon realized the automobile was a great new source of taxation. Oregon became the first state in the country to enact a gasoline tax, and vehicle registration and licensing became priority subjects. There were no vehicle identification numbers, so cars were registered with the Secretary of State by a written description of the vehicle's color and equipment. 12 of the first 30 cars registered in the state were Oldsmobiles. Ford was a distant runner-up with 3. Former Oregon Traffic Safety Director Gil Bellamy has become a highway historian. You don't have to be acquainted with Gil very long before he gives you a ride in a unique convertible that is also a boat. Gil pointed out that one of the cars on that first registration list must have been a Lemon.
When Oregon first required cars to be registered and essentially licensed, but they didn't issue license plates, of course, One of the cars that was on that first list of 218 in the Secretary of State's office was sold 6 times in 2 years. So we had our very first lemon in Oregon back in 1905.
I think I'm still driving it. The automobile soon had a profound impact on every aspect of American business and family life, and vehicle manufacturers were dreaming of profits beyond all understanding. Competition dictated that many of those hundreds would soon be out of business as the industry became a major component in the American economy. A new corporation was formed with Buick as its first member in 1907. A few weeks later, Oldsmobile became the second member company. We speak, of course, of General Motors. The corporation was founded not by a vehicle manufacturer, but by a top-notch salesman, William C. Durant. His management style has been chronicled by biographer Bernie Weisberger.
Durant always had this strange mixture of sober-sided businessman and crazy plunger and visionary in him that he inherited from both sides of his family tree. He'd made a lot of money in the buggy industry when he came into the auto game. He was, unlike Olds and Duray and Ford and the others, not a mechanic. He never got his hands dirty. He was a salesman. And he was a salesman with an extraordinary feel for the market and an anticipation of the hunger for the automobile that would develop in this country, even when the automobile was very young and unproven. So against all odds and against the advice of his presumed elders and betters, he bought Buick, developed Buick into a successful auto company between 1904 and 1909, then created, between 1904 and 1908, then created General Motors by bringing together several other auto companies, went on an acquisition spree to buy various kinds of makes and models of cars and parts suppliers, and ran the company into debt, was ousted by a consortium of bankers in 1910, went off and founded the Chevrolet Company, regained control of the company, was thrown out of it again in 1920 for a wild expansion. So what you have at root is an extraordinarily poetic character. I mean, we think of businessmen as you know, ledger types, high-collar, straight-laced businessmen. And Durant looked like that. He always dressed very conservatively, and he was very soft-spoken and things of that sort. But he really was a riverboat gambler.
Here's a bit of automotive trivia about Henry Ford and General Motors. Henry almost became a member of the conglomerate, but he insisted on a cash buyout. Durant's cash drawer was perpetually empty, and the deal fell through. It is easy to forget the original reason behind the Hellgate to Portland Challenge, that of promoting the idea for the country to start building roads. Highway construction was a hit-and-miss proposition, with no federal coordinated effort and no federal financing. The first mile of rural road to be paved in America was in 1908, when Detroit's Woodward Avenue was extended beyond the city limits. Henry Joy, the chairman of the Packard Automobile Company, wrote of driving west and asking his Omaha dealer for navigation to the road west. The dealer replied, "When you come to a fence, take it down and drive through. And then when you come to the next fence, take it down and drive on." Joy noted that he reached a point of no fences and no more fields, just ruts going across the prairie. Carl Fisher, who built the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, described navigation problems encountered during a nighttime rainstorm. "We guessed our way along until we reached a fork in the road and could not remember which was the way we had come." Fisher spotted a sign on a pole, but it was too high to read. He climbed up the hole and lit a match. The sign read, "Chew Battle Axe Tobacco." Fisher convinced the automobile industry it was in their best interest to promote a coast-to-coast rock highway to be identified as the Lincoln Highway. At his first promotional speech, Fisher raised $300,000 in pledges, and the president of Goodyear Tire immediately donated another $300,000 without even consulting his board of directors. Although he promoted good roads in his company publication 4 times, Henry Ford refused to participate. But the fund soon reached $4 million. Every city and town in the western states who wanted to be on the route, some states made promises of construction support. When the final route was announced, the arguing became even more inflamed by states and communities that had not been selected. Much of the paving money wound up as graft in politicians' pockets. The Lincoln Highway languished, far from completion. In 1919, a military convoy was organized by the Army with some 79 vehicles, 35 officers, and 265 enlisted men bound for San Francisco from the nation's capital. A young lieutenant volunteered for the assignment because he wanted to, quote, see darkest America. This lieutenant eventually became President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and it was his administration that started construction of the interstate highway system. The Army convoy faced obstacle after obstacle, but it was this move that prompted the first federal highway appropriation. There were still horse-drawn wagons and prairie schooners on the Sandy M. Wagon Road well into the 1920s. Alice Henyon's family came down 7 Mile Hill in the dead of night.
That was a very treacherous time coming down that. They had to come down part of it at night. And you can imagine trying to bring 23 head of horses down it. And you'd have to have sticks on the side of the wagon that they'd keep over close enough that they could feel the brush or the rock or whatever. They'd know that they was over far enough, but just as soon as they couldn't hear anything, they would stop, investigate, because we could have gone down over the canyon before we got down that night.
Percy McGargle's claim of a 50% grade was no doubt an exaggeration, although short stretches of the Sandy M. Wagon Road are extremely steep. Oregon Department of Transportation Deputy Director Ken Husby compares the grade with today's highway construction.
Where the route that they had to traverse with 45 to 50 degree grades is incredible compared to today's standards. Today we're looking at maximum grades of about 6%, and those were based on probably the designs of the 50s, 40s, and 50s when cars and trucks were largely underpowered, and we had to design to a standard that would allow them to travel at a reasonable speed uphill. And then also, how well could they brake on the down and the descent?
Dwight Huss had both domestic and economic difficulties. His first wife presented him with a daughter, Bernice, who spent her adult life in Oregon. Dwight and his second wife had 2 sons. This second marriage eventually went on the rocks, and Dwight's ex-wife, Bessie, married his best friend, Irving Bacon. Bacon was the artist in residence at Ford Motor Company. Dwight and Old Scout were reunited in 1931 for a second transcontinental run, this one at a more leisurely pace. Politicians and civic leaders all over the country were anxious to have their pictures taken, proudly sitting next to Dwight in the rugged runabout. Just how this venture blossomed from an idea is unclear, but the sentimental version confirms Dwight's reluctance to talk about his achievements. Dwight's father had died, leaving the auto pioneer and a brother-in-law to close his estate. The brother-in-law, while cleaning out the attic, ran across a photo album of the 1905 race, an accomplishment Dwight had never mentioned to him. The brother-in-law persuaded Dwight to contact Oldsmobile and see if a repeat trip could be made. The company immediately ran with the idea. Old Scout was brought back from Oregon, and Dwight hopped it up to a startling 10 horsepower. Visual coverage this time was not limited to still cameras, and Dwight edited this film. When Dwight and Old Scout reached the Oregon Cascades, the Sandy M. Wagon Road had become somewhat easier to travel. A newspaper photographer shot pictures of a symbolic Christmas tree being attached to Old Scout, and the Oregonian's editorial cartoonist drew a humorous cartoon of the infamous Cascade Challenge. A typical Oregon rainstorm marked Old Scout's second Portland arrival, with Mayor George Baker posing for the traditional picture. The ceremonies were somewhat hampered when Old Scout ran out of gas just before it got to City Hall. Huss and the little car went north to the border between Washington and British Columbia, making this an international event. Mock disaster was the order of the day in Grants Pass, Oregon. A group of civic leaders known as the Grants Pass Cavemen had the dubious fame of accosting every celebrity who came to town. After imbibing in an adult beverage or two, they donned bearskins, picked up their clubs, and challenged Dwight's entry. American workers suffered the defeat of the Depression in the 1930s, and Dwight found himself out of a job.
Dad got a job at the Ford Motor Company at the Rouge plant, and he gave his age at 49, and he was 64. So he worked his way up until he became the head setup man in the piston grinding department. And he worked there till he was 79 years old. 79. He was supposed to get out of there when he was 65, but they didn't know how old he was. So they came rushing down when he got around 65 years old, according to them. And they said, well, he'd have to quit. And when they found out he was 79, they just threw a fit. But they had to keep him on for 6 more months till they got somebody that could take his job over.
The American automobile industry patted itself on the back with a gigantic golden anniversary celebration. Assembly line workers rubbed shoulders with company executives at the head table, but Dwight had not been invited to participate. His road manager from the 1931 trip took umbrage at this oversight and wrote a scathing letter to a Detroit newspaper. Thereafter, Oldsmobile made sure Dwight was not forgotten. In a Story for Life magazine, Dwight was pictured in the company's latest convertible. He made several trips to Oregon and became close friends with Ken Much, founder of the historic Auto Club of Oregon.
He was a person that didn't tell about himself, you know, brag about things like I probably do.
We had heard rumors that the last 100 miles that Old Scout made in order to get into Portland on time was in the back of a flatbed in a train. Have you heard anything about that?
I don't believe it. I think it rolled on its own wheels myself.
Huss spent his latter years in Southern California playing with his grandchildren. The last time Dwight and Old Scout got together was in 1961. By then, he had married for the 3rd time, and the couple had their picture taken aboard Old Scout in Detroit's Fisher Building. Dwight died August 19th, 1964. Old Scout made a 3rd trip to Portland, this time in the lap of luxury and a very definite leisurely pace that spanned 2 years. It visited every state except Alaska and Hawaii. The occasion was America's 200th birthday, and the historic runabout was the only automobile aboard the Freedom Train, sharing an observation car with the Lunar Explorer module, visiting 48 states in 1975 and 1976. Old Scout's background and Oregon connection was ignored not only by Portland's 2 daily newspapers and television news coverage, but by state and local government as well. Curved Dash owners David Calzo from Iowa Falls, Iowa, and Dick Neller of Lansing, Michigan, have painted their 1904 cars with Old Scout and Old Steady's identification. They brought their cars to Oregon for a week-long celebration in July 1995 to honor Dwight Huss's accomplishments. A violent thunderstorm erupted when we scheduled a video shooting of the cars on 7 Mile Hill. The Forest Service said conditions were too dangerous, bringing a sigh of relief to Calzo and Neller, who did not want to put their cars in danger. Nevertheless, the 2 cars drove down a more level stretch of the historic route. Protection of the spotted owl's habitat dictated no Christmas trees would be cut down and used as had been done for brakes in 1905. Dick Neller, however, spotted a fallen log and quickly tied it to the rear axle of Old Steady. With Calzo roped to the log, a symbolic run was made down a gentle slope.
They're rolling. Hope they're rolling.
General Motors Vice President and Oldsmobile Division Manager John Rock became the co-driver on Old Scout, cheerfully stirring brush and participating in the video shoot. The Oldsmobile Division also brought John Huss and his family to Oregon to take part in ceremonies honoring Dwight's accomplishment. John took a ride aboard Old Scout, enjoying the view of the old-growth forest. At ceremonies, Oregon Historical Society Director Chet Orloff had this proclamation.
Well, to commemorate that great race and Dwight Huss's and his family's role in not only American but of course Oregon history, the Oregon Geographic Names Board at its May 27, 1995 meeting elected unanimously to name Huss Ridge, which is a ridge west of here. We have sent that nomination of Huss Ridge back to Washington, D.C., where I know it will also be unanimously accepted by the United States Geographic Names Board, thereby naming in perpetuity Huss Ridge in honor of Dwight Huss.
Ceremonies also marked the opening of the restored Santiam Wagon Road. Sweet Home District Ranger Rolf Anderson.
Today, Highway 20, right next to us, spans the Cascades, and we can cross the mountains with very little effort. But what if you want to travel the old road and take your time to absorb the history in the deep woods and enjoy being away from the heavy bustle of Highway 20? Well, you can do that now. We're here today to officially reopen the segments of the Santiam Wagon Road Restoration Project. This concludes several years of restoration and construction that included 5 bridges, erosion control structures, brush clearing, and even some rerouting where the original route just wasn't available to us anymore.
Dwight Huss's granddaughter, Judy, joined John Rock and Jim Walkinshaw from Oldsmobile in unveiling a commemorative sign about the 1905 race. John Huss had this reaction.
It's so wonderful to have a family's name made into history. So many of us don't have this opportunity.
I just want to say that I believe that I've learned more about my father and about Old Scout and Old Steady than ever before in my whole life,
Since I've come out here and heard all these stories about him.
all this information, the history.
Portions of the Santiam Wagon Road are now covered by U.S. Highway 20. Still other portions are being restored by the U.S. Forest Service and reserved for hikers, horseback riders, bicycle riders, and antique automobiles. Archaeologist Ann Rogers has hiked the entire route.
What kind of qualities or criteria are important in bringing this road back to the way it was in 1905?
Well, we look at the historic integrity of the road, whether it's in the location it was originally in, whether there are actual ruts remaining from where wagons and old vehicles went along, whether the canopy is contiguous and the vegetation is similar to how the wagon road appeared at its peak use, which was probably between 1890 and 1910, based on the toll book journals, and what other important events are associated with the wagon road.
Preservation of this historic route restoration has been assured. Forest Service archaeologist and educator Tony Farquet.
Well, it is designated as a special interest area, which is a separate land allocation from general forest or wilderness or anything else, and it comes with a 660-foot protective corridor along the wagon road, so it will be, the historic landscape will be preserved, and through time we can bring back those parts that have managed into their original condition.
Historic car collector Cliff Rutledge of Salem, Oregon, has a curved dash in his garage, which he described as a late 1902, early 1903 Olds.
I'm sure the stories that we hear about them coming across are not exaggerated, because even what we've seen today is awesome.
The 1965 Oregon visit by Old Scout and Old Steady brought the 91-year-old cars to a number of Oregon communities. Old Scout participated in a 4th of July parade in Albany, taking top honors in parade competition. Both cars occupied a place of honor in downtown Portland, being displayed in Pioneer Square. Mother Nature again took over when the 2 curved dash runabouts were scheduled as honorary pace cars for the annual antique car race at Portland's International Raceway. The threat of a cold or being chilled in rain-soaked clothes did not deter John from participating down the raceway's long straightway. Oldsmobile, which is America's oldest car company, celebrated its 100th birthday in August 1997. 4 days of festivities brought Oldsmobile owners from all over the country to participate in the centennial. Practically every model year was represented as the car lovers proudly brought their Oldsmobiles home. And even 64 curved dash runabouts were brought to Lansing for the party, with more than one owner remarking that never again will this many curved dashes be in one place at one time. Antique car clubs nationwide are making extensive recruiting efforts, looking for younger members who will ensure the preservation of our automobile heritage. There are car clubs near you that would welcome your visit and questions. This is Ed Whitaker reporting from the end of the Oregon Trail.